The coins hit the table before Eleanor Ashworth had even lifted her eyes from the floor. She heard them clink, one after another, counted out by her father's shaking hand, and she understood in that single sound that her life had just been decided without a single word spoken to her. Her mother stood by the door with her arms folded, watching the exchange the way one watches a merchant close a deal on a horse. Eleanor was 23 years old, kneeling on the cold stone floor of her family's crumbling hall, and she was being sold. The man across the table was not cruel-looking. He wore a fine gray coat and spoke in a calm, businesslike voice, but his words cut deeper than any shout could have. He said the Duke of Ravensmere required a wife within the month, and that his employer did not care about beauty or fortune, only that the woman could be delivered quietly and without scandal. Eleanor's father had been the one to offer her, whispering to anyone who would listen that his daughter was barren, that no honest man would want her, that this arrangement was a mercy disguised as a transaction. Eleanor did not cry. She had stopped crying about this particular wound years ago, back when a physician first suggested she might never bear children, and her mother had looked at her the way one looks at a broken tool. Since then, the word barren had followed her through every gathering, every whispered conversation behind fans, every rejected proposal. She had learned to carry it the way one carries a stone in a pocket, heavy but familiar. The agent placed a folded paper in front of her father. Eleanor watched her father's hand tremble as he signed it, not from guilt, she realized, but from relief. One less mouth to feed, one less embarrassment to explain at dinner parties. Her mother did not even look at her as the agent rose and gestured for Eleanor to follow him outside, where a carriage waited, black and polished, bearing a crest she did not recognize. Eleanor rose on unsteady legs. She did not look back at the house that had never truly been a home. As she crossed the threshold, she caught sight of her younger brother Henry watching from the top of the stairs, his young face confused, uncertain whether he should say goodbye. She offered him a small, tight smile, the only comfort she had left to give, and then she walked out into the gray afternoon light and let herself be helped into the carriage by a footman who would not meet her eyes. The door closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and Eleanor braced herself for whatever cruelty waited at the end of the road. She had heard stories about desperate men who married for convenience and then discarded their wives once the paperwork was settled, locking them away in distant wings of cold houses to be forgotten entirely. She pressed her palm flat against the carriage window and watched her childhood home shrink into the distance, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow relief that at least the waiting was finally over. The journey took most of the day. Eleanor watched the countryside change from the familiar hedgerows of her childhood to wide-open fields she did not recognize, rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep, small villages with smoke curling from chimneys, and eventually to the looming silhouette of a great house rising against the darkening sky. Ravensmere Hall was larger than anything she had ever seen, its windows glowing with warm light, its stone walls both beautiful and intimidating, towers rising on either side like silent sentries. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of a wide set of steps, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with dread so sharp it nearly stole her breath. A man stood waiting at the top of the steps. He was tall, dressed simply for a duke, without the excessive lace and jewelry she had expected from a man of his rank. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had run his hands through it more than once that day, and his expression was unreadable as he watched the carriage door open. Eleanor stepped down, expecting to be looked over like livestock at market, the way her father's agent had looked at her only hours before. Instead, the Duke descended the steps himself, which surprised her, since she had assumed a servant would greet her and leave the master of the house to appear only once she had been properly presented. He stopped a respectful distance away and studied her face, not her figure, not her hands folded tightly in front of her, her face, as though searching for something specific there. Eleanor lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, refusing to let him see how frightened she truly was, though her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. He introduced himself as Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ravensmere, and his voice was quieter than she expected, without the arrogance she had braced herself for. He said he was sorry for the manner in which the arrangement had been made, that he knew it was not how any woman should be brought into a marriage, and that he hoped, in time, she might find some measure of peace within these walls. Eleanor did not know how to respond to an apology from the man who had just purchased her, so for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply standing there in the cooling evening air, unsure whether to trust the gentleness in his voice. He led her inside himself, past a hall of servants who bowed and curtsied with practiced precision, their eyes flicking toward her with open curiosity they were too well trained to voice aloud. Eleanor felt every gaze on her, felt the weight of their unspoken judgment, and wondered how many of them already knew the reason behind her arrival, how many had already heard the whispered word that had followed her from her father's house. That evening Julian did not join her for dinner, sending word instead through an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Fenwick that he had matters to attend to and that Eleanor should rest after her long journey. Eleanor ate alone in a dining room large enough to seat 40 people, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight, the clink of her own fork against the china, sounding unbearably loud in the vast empty space. She thought of her parents, likely celebrating their newfound relief over their own dinner table, free at last of the daughter who had cost them nothing but shame and unmet expectation. Mrs. Fenwick showed her to her chamber afterward, a large room with tall windows overlooking dark gardens, furnished more finely than anything Eleanor had known before. The housekeeper was kind in a brisk, efficient way, offering to send up a maid to help her undress, and Eleanor accepted gratefully, too exhausted from the day's events to manage the unfamiliar fastenings of her traveling gown alone. The wedding took place 5 days later in a small chapel on the estate grounds, attended by only a handful of witnesses, servants mostly, along with a vicar who spoke the ceremony in a voice devoid of the warmth such occasions usually carried. There was no joy in the ceremony, no flowers chosen with care, no family gathered to celebrate. Eleanor wore a gown that had been altered to fit her overnight, its seams still slightly loose in places, and she said her vows in a steady voice that surprised even herself. Julian's voice, when he spoke his own vows, carried a weight she could not quite interpret, something between resignation and resolve, as though he too understood the strangeness of promising forever to a stranger. When the ceremony ended, he took her hand only briefly, just long enough to help her down from the chapel steps, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his skin against hers and wondered, with a flicker of confusion, why a man who needed nothing from her but an heir would bother being gentle at all. There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration among friends, only a quiet return to the great house where Eleanor would now be expected to live out the rest of her days. That night, as Eleanor sat alone in the chamber that had been prepared for her, she stared out the window at the dark gardens below and tried to understand what kind of life she had just entered. She was a duchess now, in name if nothing else, married to a man she did not know, in a house full of strangers who whispered about her the moment she passed through a doorway. She did not know yet whether Julian Ashcombe was a kind man or simply a patient one, biding his time before the truth about her body became an excuse to send her away, the way so many other unwanted wives had been sent away before her. She only knew that for the first time in years, no one had called her Barren to her face, and somehow, that small mercy, small as it was enough to let her close her eyes and finally sleep. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had not expected. She woke each morning to a house that ran with quiet efficiency, servants who addressed her as Your Grace with a formality that still felt foreign on her ears, and a husband who seemed determined to give her more freedom than she knew what to do with. Julian did not summon her to his study for instructions. He did not demand she account for her time or explain how she spent her days. Instead, he simply told her, on her second morning at Ravensmere Hall, standing in the doorway of the breakfast room with his coat already half buttoned for a ride out to the fields, that the house was hers to manage as she saw fit, and that his only request was that she be comfortable. Eleanor did not trust it. She had spent her whole life waiting for kindness to reveal itself as a trick, some hidden cost waiting to surface once she had let her guard down completely. She kept to herself in those first weeks, taking her meals in smaller rooms rather than the grand dining hall, avoiding the parts of the house where she might cross paths with her husband, retreating instead to the small library on the eastern side of the house where sunlight fell warm across old leather chairs, and no one thought to look for her. But small things began to chip away at her guard, one after another, until she could no longer pretend not to notice them. She noticed that when she skipped dinner one evening, too anxious to face the empty dining hall alone, a tray appeared outside her door within the hour, still warm, arranged with more care than any servant would bother with unless specifically instructed to do so. She noticed that when a steward named Mr. Barrow spoke to her sharply one afternoon, questioning her authority to change the household linens without his approval, Julian appeared in the hallway moments later, having apparently overheard from his study, and told the steward in a low, controlled voice that his wife's word carried the same weight as his own in this house, and that it would not be questioned again under any circumstance. Mr. Barrow apologized immediately, his face pale, and never spoke to her that way again. Eleanor did not know what to make of a husband who defended her honor before she had even asked him to, who seemed to notice her discomfort before she voiced it aloud. She began to watch him more closely, searching for the motive behind his kindness, and found instead A man who seemed almost as uncertain of himself as she was of her new life. A man carrying burdens of his own that he rarely spoke of. He rode out early each morning to oversee the estate's fields, returning windswept and quiet, often retreating to his study for hours at a time, the candlelight beneath his door still visible long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. He rarely spoke of his family, and when her curiosity got the better of her one evening, and she asked about his parents over a rare shared dinner, his expression closed like a door shutting, and he simply said his father was not a man worth discussing, before quickly changing the subject to the weather and the harvest. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the estate's gardens, drawn outside by the unusually warm sunlight after weeks of gray skies, and she discovered Julian there as well, kneeling beside a bed of roses that had clearly been neglected for some time, their stems overgrown, weeds choking the soil around their roots. He was pulling weeds with his own hands, his coat discarded on a nearby bench, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, dirt smudged across his forearms. He looked up when he heard her approach and, rather than appearing embarrassed at being caught in such an unrefined task, he simply gestured to the space beside him and said the roses had been his mother's favorite, and that no one else seemed to care whether they lived or died since she had passed. Eleanor knelt beside him without quite deciding to, her fine skirts pressing into the damp earth, and for the first time since her arrival, she found herself speaking freely, asking about the garden, about the estate, about the small details of his daily life that had nothing to do with duchesses or heirs or duty. She asked which flowers grew best in this soil, and he told her, his voice growing warmer as he spoke of something he clearly loved. Julian answered her questions with a patience that surprised her, occasionally glancing sideways at her with something that looked almost like relief, as though he too had been starved for ordinary conversation. For a brief hour, kneeling in the dirt beside a man she barely knew, Eleanor forgot to be afraid. That evening, for the first time, Julian joined her for dinner without sending word ahead. The conversation was halting at first, both of them unused to speaking so directly with one another across a table meant for many more guests, but it grew easier as the meal went on, the silence between courses filling instead with small observations, small questions, small pieces of themselves offered cautiously. Eleanor learned that Julian had inherited the title only 2 years earlier, after his father's sudden death left the estate in disarray, debts hidden behind a facade of wealth, tenants left unpaid for months. She learned that a cousin named Edmund stood ready to claim everything if Julian failed to marry and produce an heir before a deadline set by his father's own will, a cruel condition meant to punish Julian for a falling out between father and son that Julian did not fully explain, though the pain in his voice when he mentioned it told her enough. She began to understand, slowly, piece by piece, that Julian's need for a wife was not born of cold calculation alone, but of a desperate attempt to protect something he had already lost too much fighting for. Tenants who depended on him, a legacy his father had nearly destroyed, a name that meant something only if he could keep it from falling into Edmund's careless hands. Still, the shadow of her own body's supposed failure hung over every conversation they did not have. Eleanor noticed how careful Julian was never to mention children, never to ask when she might expect to conceive, never to so much as glance meaningfully at her middle the way other men had done at gatherings before her marriage, weighing her worth in silent calculation. She began to dread the day he would tire of waiting, the day the whispers that had followed her from her father's house would finally reach him properly and change the way he looked at her, the warmth she had only just begun to trust curdling into disappointment. That day came sooner than she expected, though not in the way she had feared. Julian's aunt, Lady Margaret Ashcombe, arrived at Ravensmere Hall unannounced one gray morning nearly a month into Eleanor's new life there, sweeping through the front doors with the confidence of a woman who considered the estate as much her domain as anyone else's, her traveling cloak still damp from the drizzle outside. She was Julian's father's sister, a widow with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and from the moment she laid eyes on Eleanor, standing awkwardly in the entrance hall in a plain morning dress, her disapproval was unmistakable, written clearly across her pinched features. Lady Margaret did not bother with pleasantries. Over tea that first afternoon, seated stiffly in the drawing room while Julian was away inspecting a distant tenant farm, she asked Eleanor bluntly whether the rumors about her condition were true, whether the family line was truly at risk of dying out entirely with this hasty, unsuitable marriage her nephew had rushed into without proper consultation. Eleanor felt the old shame rise in her chest, the familiar sting of being reduced to a single, cruel word, but she forced herself to answer calmly, her hands steady around her teacup despite the tremor she felt beneath her ribs, saying only that time would reveal what time would reveal, and that she did not intend to discuss such private matters over tea with anyone, however closely related to her husband. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing further that day, merely sipping her tea with an air of quiet, dangerous calculation. Eleanor later learned from a sympathetic maid named Betsy that Lady Margaret had been the one to arrange Julian's father's first marriage, a match that ended in scandal and heartbreak when his first wife left the estate entirely, and that Lady Margaret had never forgiven herself for the role she played in that disaster. Now she seemed determined to prevent Julian from making what she considered a similar mistake, even if it meant tearing his current marriage apart before it had a chance to become something real. Eleanor began to understand, with a growing unease that kept her awake long into the night, that the greatest threat to her fragile new life might not come from her husband at all, but from the people who surrounded him, people convinced they knew better than he did what he needed, people who would stop at nothing to prove themselves right. She thought of the word Barren, and how it had already cost her one family entirely. She wondered, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling of her new chamber, whether it might cost her a second. The physician arrived on a cold morning 3 weeks after Lady Margaret's first visit, summoned without Eleanor's knowledge or consent, while Julian was away in London settling matters with his solicitor. Eleanor learned of his purpose only when Betsy informed her, with obvious discomfort, wringing her apron in nervous hands, that Lady Margaret had arranged for a Dr. Whitfield to examine the new Duchess and provide a written assessment of her condition, one that could then be presented to Julian upon his return as evidence of what everyone already suspected. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day she arrived, the moment her body would be inspected and judged and reduced once again to a single verdict, exactly as it had been years before when the first physician's cold pronouncement had set her entire fate in motion. She considered refusing outright. She stood in her chamber with her hands clenched at her sides, imagining herself telling Betsy that no physician would touch her without her husband's direct instruction and consent. But the fear of what refusal might suggest, the fear of appearing to hide something shameful, kept her from acting on that impulse. Instead, she smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin the way she had taught herself to do since childhood whenever the world threatened to break her, and walked downstairs to face what was coming, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor like the ticking of some inevitable clock. Dr. Whitfield was an older man with kind eyes but a manner that suggested he had performed this particular examination many times before, for many desperate families across the county, each one hoping for a different answer than the last. He explained the process to Eleanor in clinical, gentle terms, and she endured it the same way she had endured every humiliation before it, with her spine straight and her expression carefully blank, refusing to give Lady Margaret, who waited in the adjoining sitting room with the door slightly ajar, the satisfaction of hearing her cry out or plead. When it was over, Dr. Whitfield told her honestly, folding his instruments away with quiet care, that his findings were inconclusive, that there was no clear physical evidence to support or deny the claims that had followed her for years, and that such matters were often far more complicated than a single examination could ever reveal, dependent on factors no physician of his time could fully understand or explain. Eleanor thanked him quietly, her voice steady though her hands shook slightly at her sides, and retreated to her chamber, where she sat by the window for a long time, staring out at nothing, waiting for the next blow to fall. It came at dinner 3 days later, when Julian had finally returned from London, though not from the direction she expected. Lady Margaret, seated at the table with an air of triumph she did not bother to hide, her chin lifted with the satisfaction of a woman certain of victory, announced to Julian that the physician's report was inconclusive, and that in her opinion, this uncertainty was reason enough to consider quietly dissolving the marriage before the deadline in his father's will made any dissolution legally impossible. She spoke as though Eleanor were not sitting directly across from her at the very same table, as though the woman being discussed and dismantled had no right to a voice in her own fate. Eleanor watched Julian's face change slowly, the muscles along his jaw tightening with each word his aunt spoke. She had seen him calm and patient and quietly kind in the weeks since her arrival, but she had never seen him angry, not until that moment. He set down his fork with deliberate, controlled force and told his aunt, in a voice that carried through the entire dining hall and silenced even the servants who lingered near the sideboard, that no physician's report would ever change his mind about his wife, that he had chosen Eleanor knowing exactly what had been said about her long before the wedding, and that he considered the matter entirely closed. He added, his voice sharpening further with each word, that anyone who repeated such talk within his home again, family or otherwise, would no longer be welcome beneath his roof, regardless of blood or history between them. Lady Margaret's face went pale, then red with fury she could not voice, and she left the table without another word, her chair scraping loudly against the floor in the sudden silence. Eleanor sat frozen, her heart pounding, unable to process what she had just witnessed. No one had ever defended her like that before, not even members of her own family, and certainly not with such open conviction, such unwavering declaration of loyalty spoken in front of witnesses. When the servants had cleared the room and the two of them were finally alone, the candles burning low, Julian turned to her with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between apology and something warmer she did not yet dare to identify. He told her he was sorry she had been put through such an ordeal in his absence, that he should have refused his aunt's demand the moment he learned of it, and that he had not realized how deeply the situation had already progressed, until it was nearly too late to stop it entirely. Eleanor found herself studying his face in the candlelight, searching for the calculation she had assumed must exist beneath his kindness, the hidden motive that would eventually reveal itself the way it always had before. She found none. Instead, she found a man who looked genuinely troubled by her pain, who seemed to carry some of the weight of it himself as though it were his own burden to bear. She asked him quietly why it mattered so much to him, why a man who needed an heir above all else, whose entire inheritance hung on the question, would fight so fiercely to keep a wife whose ability to provide one remained in such stubborn question. Julian was quiet for a long moment before he answered, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. He told her that when he had first seen her, kneeling in that cold hall with her father counting coins over her head like she was livestock at auction, he had recognized something in her that he rarely saw in anyone, a kind of quiet strength that refused to break even under the weight of complete humiliation. He said he had married her expecting only a practical arrangement, a solution to a legal problem set by a father he barely respected, but that in the weeks since, watching her manage the household, watching her kneel beside him in the dirt without complaint, watching her hold her chin high, even when his own aunt tried to tear her down, he had come to see her as far more than that, and that the thought of losing her now, for any reason, unsettled him more than the loss of the title ever could. Eleanor did not know how to respond to such honesty. She had spent so many years bracing herself against cruelty that she had never learned how to accept kindness without suspicion, without waiting for the catch that always seemed to follow. But something in his voice, in the careful way he had chosen his words, convinced her that he meant every one of them completely. For the first time since the coins had hit the table in her father's hall, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had not simply traded one prison for another, but had found, against every expectation, something that might one day resemble a home. The house party arrived like a storm no one had warned Eleanor about. She learned of it only 2 days before the guests were due to descend upon Ravensmere Hall, when Lady Margaret, who had not left the estate despite Julian's warning weeks earlier, choosing instead to remain in a distant guest wing out of spite, announced over breakfast that she had taken the liberty of inviting several old family friends for a week of entertainment, insisting that a new duchess ought to be properly introduced to society, before whispers about her began to shape opinions without any face to attach them to. Julian's jaw tightened at the news, but the invitations had already been sent, hand-delivered to households across the county, and canceling them now would only invite more gossip than allowing the visit to proceed as planned. Eleanor spent the following 2 days in a state of quiet dread, though she said nothing of it to Julian, not wanting to appear weak in front of a man who had already defended her honor once and might grow weary of doing so again. She oversaw the preparations herself, working alongside Mrs. Fenwick late into each evening, determined to prove, if only to herself, that she was capable of managing the household properly, that Lady Margaret's disapproval had no real foundation to stand upon. The guests arrived on a bright afternoon, filling the halls of Ravensmere with laughter and conversation that felt foreign after weeks of relative quiet. Carriages lined up along the drive, trunks carried in by a steady stream of footmen. Eleanor greeted each of them with practiced grace, though she felt their curious eyes assessing her from head to toe, weighing the rumors they had surely heard against the woman standing before them in her finest gown. She held her composure through introductions, through polite small talk about the weather and the journey, through the subtle, probing questions about her family and her upbringing that she had learned to deflect with careful vagueness, offering just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything of substance. It was on the second evening of the gathering that Eleanor first saw Charlotte Winslow. The woman moved through the drawing room with an ease that immediately marked her as someone accustomed to such gatherings, greeting old acquaintances with warm familiarity, her laughter light and genuine, her gown a deep emerald that suited her fair complexion perfectly. Eleanor noticed, with a small tightening in her chest, the way several of the older guests glanced between Charlotte and Julian with knowing expressions, whispering behind gloved hands, and it did not take long for a well-meaning but careless guest, an older woman named Mrs. Pruitt, to explain, in hushed tones over cards, that Charlotte Winslow had once been expected to become the future Duchess of Ravensmere, before a sudden collapse in her family's fortunes made the match impossible some years earlier. Eleanor watched Charlotte across the room for the rest of the evening, unable to help herself despite every effort to focus her attention elsewhere. She was beautiful in an effortless way, confident in a manner Eleanor had never been permitted to be, carrying herself like a woman who had never once been told she was worthless by the very people meant to protect her. Eleanor thought of her own arrival at Ravensmere, delivered like cargo in a closed carriage only weeks before, and the comparison made something cold settle in her stomach that she could not quite shake for the remainder of the evening. Julian, for his part, treated Charlotte with polite distance, nothing more than the courtesy owed to any guest under his roof, but Lady Margaret made certain the two of them were seated together at dinner each evening, made certain their paths crossed during the daily walks and card games that filled the week, orchestrating small moments of proximity with the practiced skill of a woman who had spent a lifetime managing society's delicate arrangements. Eleanor told herself she did not care, that Julian's kindness toward her had already proven itself genuine in ways that could not be faked, but the old fear, the fear that had shaped her entire life since childhood, whispered otherwise in the quiet hours before sleep. It told her that Julian would eventually see what he had given up, that a woman like Charlotte, whole and unquestioned by society, would always outshine a woman the world had already labeled broken beyond repair. By the fourth night of the house party, Eleanor found she could no longer bear to sit through another dinner watching Lady Margaret maneuver Charlotte into every possible moment of closeness with Julian, watching the way the other guests seemed to nod along approvingly, as though quietly rewriting the story of who truly belonged at Julian's side. She excused herself early, claiming a headache that was not entirely a lie, and made her way out to the gardens instead, seeking the same quiet comfort she had found there once before, kneeling beside Julian among his mother's roses weeks earlier. The night air was cool, and the garden was empty, lit only by the pale wash of moonlight over the hedges, the scent of roses heavy in the still air. Eleanor sat on the stone bench near the rosebeds and finally allowed the tears she had been holding back all week to fall, silent and bitter, as she thought of every reason she had ever been told she was not enough, every rejected proposal, every whispered word behind fans, every cold look from her own mother. She did not hear Julian's footsteps until he was nearly beside her, and she turned away quickly, wiping at her face with trembling fingers, ashamed to be caught in such a moment of weakness by the very man she had been trying so hard not to disappoint. Julian did not ask what was wrong, which surprised her more than anything else that evening. He simply sat beside her in the darkness for a long moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, his presence steady and unhurried, and then he spoke, quietly, as though choosing each word with great care before letting it leave his lips. He told her he had noticed her absence at dinner, and had come looking for her, not out of obligation, but because the evening had felt wrong without her presence beside him. He said he was aware of what the household believed about Charlotte, aware of his aunt's efforts to remind him of a match that had never truly been his choice to begin with, and he wanted Eleanor to understand something clearly, without any doubt lingering between them. He told her that when his family's fortunes had once made Charlotte a possible match, arranged by their families with far more enthusiasm than either of them had ever shown for it themselves, he had felt nothing beyond polite obligation toward the arrangement, nothing resembling the quiet ache he now felt whenever Eleanor was not in the room. He said that what he felt for Eleanor was entirely different, that it had grown slowly, without his full awareness, from the day he watched her rise from that carriage with more dignity than most people managed in a lifetime of comfort and privilege. He said he had not simply needed a wife to satisfy the terms of his father's will, he had needed her, specifically, because she was the only person who had ever looked at complete ruin and refused to let it define who she was. Eleanor turned to face him fully then, searching his expression in the dim light for any trace of performance, any hint that his words were merely meant to comfort her through a difficult evening and would be forgotten by morning. She found none. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, and for the first time since the coins had hit her father's table, Eleanor allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that she was wanted, not despite her past, but in spite of every cruel thing it had taught her to believe about herself. Neither of them spoke for a long while after that, content simply to sit together beneath the quiet stars, the distant sound of laughter from the house fading into something that no longer felt like a threat. When Eleanor finally returned to the house, she walked past the drawing room where Charlotte still laughed among the other guests, and felt, for the first time in years, no fear at all, only a quiet, settled certainty that had not existed within her a single hour before. The house party ended 2 days later, the guests departing in a slow parade of carriages, Charlotte among them with a polite, unbothered smile that suggested she had never once viewed Eleanor as any true rival at all, her presence merely a pawn in Lady Margaret's larger failing game. Lady Margaret herself watched the carriages depart with a tight, frustrated expression, and though she said nothing that day, Eleanor sensed the older woman was far from finished with her efforts to unravel the marriage she so deeply disapproved of. The letter arrived on a morning Eleanor would never forget, carried in on a silver tray by Betsy, whose hands trembled slightly as she presented it, her eyes downcast as though she already suspected the trouble it contained. Lady Margaret had written to Eleanor's parents directly, without consulting either Eleanor or Julian, inviting them to Ravensmere Hall under the pretense of a family reconciliation, suggesting in careful, honeyed language that enough time had passed for old wounds to heal, and that a new duchess deserved the support of her own blood during this important season of her life. Eleanor read the invitation twice before the full weight of it settled over her, and she understood immediately, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her stomach, that reconciliation was not Lady Margaret's true purpose at all. She confronted Julian with the letter clutched in her hand, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain composed, and told him she suspected his aunt intended something far crueler than a family reunion, something designed specifically to wound. Julian's expression darkened as he read the letter himself, his jaw tightening in that familiar way she had come to recognize, and he confirmed her fear plainly, saying that his aunt had grown desperate in her efforts to end the marriage, having failed with the physician, and failed with Charlotte, and that inviting Eleanor's parents into the house, parents who had once called their own daughter Barren without hesitation or shame, seemed exactly the kind of calculated cruelty Lady Margaret was capable of when she believed she was protecting the family name above all else. Eleanor wanted to refuse the visit entirely, to write back immediately and forbid her parents from ever crossing the threshold of Ravensmere Hall again for as long as she lived. But Julian gently suggested another path, taking her hands in his as he spoke. He told her that hiding from her parents' cruelty had never once made it disappear from her life, that the only way to truly end its power over her was to face it directly, on her own terms, in her own home, with him standing beside her, rather than absent as he had been for every humiliation before their marriage began. Eleanor considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind through a long, sleepless night, and though fear still coiled tightly in her chest at the thought of facing her parents again, she found a flicker of something else beneath it, something that felt almost like readiness, almost like strength she had not known she still possessed. Her parents arrived a week later, dressed in their finest clothes despite their modest means, clearly expecting to bask in whatever status their daughter's unexpected marriage might now afford them, their carriage rattling up the drive with an eagerness that made Eleanor's stomach twist with something between anger and pity. Eleanor watched from the top of the grand staircase as they were shown into the entrance hall, her father already glancing around at the fine furnishings with open, undisguised greed, and she felt none of the old fear she had once carried in their presence, not the way she had expected to feel it. Instead, she felt a strange, clarifying calm settle over her, the kind that comes only after enough pain has finally burned away every illusion a person once held about the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. The evening began pleasantly enough, with Lady Margaret orchestrating polite conversation over dinner with practiced skill, steering the discussion carefully toward Eleanor's childhood, toward the circumstances of her marriage, until finally, with practiced casualness that fooled no one paying close attention, she asked Eleanor's mother directly whether she had ever truly believed her daughter capable of providing an heir, given everything the physicians had once said all those years ago. The table went silent, the clink of silverware halting mid-motion. Eleanor felt every eye turned toward her, and she understood in an instant that this had been the plan all along, to force her mother to repeat the word that had haunted her entire life, in front of the household, in front of Julian, in front of everyone who might otherwise have come to respect her as their true duchess. Her mother, never one to resist an opportunity to align herself with power and approval, opened her mouth to answer, her eyes flicking toward Lady Margaret as though seeking permission to proceed. But Eleanor spoke first, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the long table without a single tremor of doubt. She said she remembered the day her family decided her worth, remembered kneeling on a cold floor while her father counted coins over her head like she was livestock at auction, remembered her mother watching without a single word of protest or comfort offered in that moment. She asked the assembled guests, quite simply, what kind of parents measure a daughter's value only by what her body might one day produce for someone else's benefit, and whether such parents deserved any place at all in the life their daughter had since managed to build for herself, against every expectation they had ever set for her. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor's father's face had gone pale, his mouth working uselessly as he searched for some defense and found none worth voicing. Her mother's composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained expression collapsing into something closer to shame, though whether it was shame for her actions or simply for being exposed so thoroughly in front of such distinguished company, Eleanor could not say, and found she no longer cared to know either way. Julian rose from his seat then, standing beside Eleanor's chair with a quiet, protective presence that needed no further words to explain itself. He addressed her parents directly, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he had used against his aunt weeks earlier, informing them that their welcome at Ravensmere Hall had come to an end that very evening, and that any future correspondence would be considered an intrusion rather than a courtesy extended in good faith. Eleanor's parents left within the hour, their carriage disappearing down the long drive in the fading evening light, and this time, Eleanor did not watch them go with any sense of loss at all, only a quiet, settled peace that felt like the closing of a long overdue chapter. Lady Margaret's plan had collapsed entirely, her final effort to divide the marriage having instead strengthened it beyond anything she could have anticipated or hoped to prevent. She said little for the remainder of the evening, retreating early to her chamber, and within days, quietly departed Ravensmere Hall altogether, her influence over the household finally, decisively broken beyond any hope of repair. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall long after the guests had gone, Julian's hand resting gently at the small of her back, and felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for as long as she could remember finally, fully begin to loosen its grip on her heart. Winter had settled fully over Ravensmere Hall by the time Eleanor first noticed the changes in her own body. Subtle at first, easy enough to dismiss as simple fatigue from the long, difficult months behind her, from the stress of Lady Margaret's schemes and her parents' cruel visit. It was only when the household physician called for an unrelated concern regarding a persistent cough among the staff, gently suggested she might wish to consider another explanation for her recent tiredness and occasional sickness in the mornings, that Eleanor allowed herself to hope for something she had long ago convinced herself was entirely impossible for her body to achieve. She did not tell Julian immediately. She sat with the possibility alone for several days, half afraid that speaking it aloud might somehow undo it, that the universe which had already taken so much from her might reconsider this one unexpected gift if she dared to acknowledge it too soon or too publicly. But the truth became undeniable within a fortnight, confirmed beyond doubt by a second physician's careful examination, and Eleanor finally found herself standing outside Julian's study late one evening, her hand raised to knock, uncertain how to even begin such an important conversation. When she finally told him, her voice trembling with something that was not quite joy and not quite fear, but a tangled mixture of both feelings at once, she found herself almost apologizing for the news, bracing herself out of old habit for a reaction that would somehow diminish her worth in his eyes, as though this news alone was the only thing that had ever made her worthy of his affection and attention. She told him plainly, forcing the words out before her courage could fail her, that she needed him to understand this was not the reason she believed he loved her, that she still remembered every word he had spoken to her in the garden months before, and that she did not want this news to overshadow what they had already built between them through honest struggle. Julian crossed the room to her without hesitation, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that erased any lingering doubt she might have carried into that room. He told her, his voice thick with emotion he did not bother to hide from her for even a moment, that the child growing within her was a blessing, certainly, a gift beyond anything he had dared to hope for, but never once the reason he had chosen to love her in the first place. He reminded her of the days she had stood in that cold hall, sold like property by the people who should have protected her above all else, and how even then, stripped of everything she owned or deserved, she had carried herself with a dignity that had captured him completely before he ever fully understood what he was feeling toward her. He told her the child changed nothing about the depth of what he already felt, only added another layer of joy to a foundation that had never needed proving to begin with. The months that followed passed with a gentleness Eleanor had never known life could offer someone like her. She spent her days walking the gardens that had once seemed to hold only sadness, now blooming again under careful tending from both her own hands and Julian's, and her evenings by the fire with him, planning quietly for the future neither of them had dared to imagine when their marriage first began under such cold, transactional circumstances. Word of the coming heir spread quickly through the estate and beyond its borders, and Eleanor found, to her quiet astonishment, that the same society which had once whispered the word Barren behind their fans now spoke her name with something closer to respect and even admiration. Their daughter was born on a bright spring morning, her cries filling the halls of Ravensmere with a sound Eleanor had once believed she would never hear echo through her own home in her entire lifetime. Julian held his daughter for the first time with hands that shook slightly, his composed exterior finally giving way entirely to open, unguarded joy that brought unashamed tears to his eyes. And Eleanor watched him from her bed, exhausted and overwhelmed but deeply happy, feeling a peace so complete it left no room for the old fears that had shaped so much of her life until now. They named her Grace, a name Eleanor had chosen herself, for the mercy that had finally found her after so many years of cruelty. Lady Margaret sent a brief letter of congratulations from wherever she had settled after leaving Ravensmere, her tone stiff but no longer openly hostile, and Eleanor found she felt no bitterness toward the woman at all, only a distant, quiet indifference that spoke to how thoroughly her power over Eleanor's happiness had finally faded into insignificance. Her parents sent nothing at all in response to the news of their granddaughter's birth, and Eleanor found she did not miss their silence in the slightest, her heart already full enough without their approval. One evening, some weeks after their daughter's birth, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Julian rock their child gently to sleep, humming a tune she did not recognize but assumed had once belonged to his own mother, passed down through generations of quiet love. She thought back to the doorway of her childhood home, to her own mother standing there with arms folded, offering nothing but cold judgment to a daughter who had needed love and reassurance instead of contempt. Eleanor understood now, standing in this different doorway, watching this different family she had helped to build from nothing, that the measure of her worth had never truly belonged to anyone else's judgment at all. Not her parents, not Lady Margaret, not even the physicians who had once tried to define her by a single word. She crossed the room and settled beside Julian, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep peacefully in her cradle, two people who had each, in their own way, once been treated as burdens rather than blessings by those who should have cherished them, now building together a family that neither of them had ever truly believed they deserved to have. Outside, the last light of evening faded gently over the gardens Julian's mother had once tended with her own hands, and inside, for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, there was nothing left to fear at all, only the quiet, steady warmth of a home finally, truly earned. Years later, when their daughter Grace had grown old enough to run through the gardens on her own small legs, chasing butterflies among the roses that Eleanor now tended with the same devotion Julian's mother once had, a second child arrived, a son this time, whose birth silenced any remaining doubt anyone in the county might have dared to whisper about the Duchess of Ravensmere. Eleanor watched her husband carry their son through the halls of the estate, announcing his arrival to every servant who crossed his path with a pride he no longer bothered to contain, and she thought of how far they had both traveled from that cold afternoon, when coins had been counted over her bowed head, like she was nothing more than property to be traded away. She wrote, on rare occasions, to her brother Henry, who had grown into a kind young man untouched by their parents' cruelty in the way she had been, and through him, she learned that her parents' fortunes had continued to decline in her absence, their reputation tarnished beyond repair by the story of that humiliating dinner that had somehow, despite everyone's best efforts at discretion, made its way through society's whispered channels. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet acknowledgement that consequences, however delayed, tended to find their way home eventually, the way all things did. Lady Margaret, in her final years, wrote more frequently, her letters growing warmer with time and distance, an old woman's regret softening edges that had once been sharp enough to wound. Eleanor chose to forgive her, not for Lady Margaret's sake, but for her own, understanding that carrying old anger served no purpose in a life that had finally become full of genuine joy. When Lady Margaret passed, Julian and Eleanor attended the small funeral together, standing side by side as they had learned to do through every trial that had once threatened to tear them apart before their love had even fully taken root. On quiet evenings, long after both children had grown and the halls of Ravensmere had settled into a comfortable, familiar rhythm, Eleanor would sometimes find herself back in that same garden, kneeling among the roses the way she had on that first afternoon, and Julian would join her without a word needed between them, kneeling beside her in the dirt just as he always had. They rarely spoke of the day the coins had hit her father's table anymore, that memory finally losing its power to wound after so many years of proof to the contrary. But on the anniversary of their wedding each year, Julian would take her hand and tell her, quietly, that choosing her had been the only decision in his entire life he had never once doubted. Not for a single moment. From the very first day he saw her rise from that carriage with more dignity than the whole world had ever thought to grant her. And Eleanor, who had once believed herself unworthy of love in any form, who had carried the word Barren like a stone in her pocket for so many years it had nearly become part of her, finally understood, standing in that garden with her husband beside her, and the sound of her children's laughter drifting from somewhere beyond the hedges, that she had never been broken at all. She had simply been waiting, all along, for someone willing to see the whole of her, and in Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ravensmere, she had finally, completely found him.